Tonight, the breaking news as we... Good evening, I'm David Muir. Tonight, we take you to the Black Sea, where on November 14th, 2025, the quiet streets and guarded corridors of Novorossiysk settled under a calm so absolute it felt unnatural. Across the water, faint anomalies were already beginning to stir, small, almost imperceptible hints that something was moving beneath the surface of routine. No alarms, no warnings, just the first silent thread tugging at a city's confidence. By sunrise, everything would change. Chapter 1: The Night the Coastline Held Its Breath. In the hours before dawn on November 14, 2025, the fortified coastal district of Novorossiysk, a port long associated with the defensive might of Russia, rested under a quiet veil of darkness, the kind that makes even the most experienced sentries drift toward a rhythm of complacency. Though the base was technically on high alert due to months of tension with Ukraine, the night felt almost rehearsed. Predictable patrols, routine sweeps, and a coastline that looked as still as polished stone. Yet something subtle had already begun to shift offshore, miles beyond the field of human perception. Small, barely noticeable flickers touched the edges of distant sensor screens, tiny anomalies that the technicians monitoring them dismissed as clutter, reflections, or atmospheric quirks. What no one understood yet, at least not within the dimly lit command shelters or along the wind-bitten watchposts, was that these faint shapes were not random. They were the earliest hints of a much larger orchestration, a quiet overture to a story that would reshape how a supposedly unbreakable stronghold saw itself. And it's interesting to imagine this moment from a human perspective. If an observer had witnessed just the first flash without any context, one plume, one sudden bloom of rising light, would it have looked like an accident? An electrical malfunction, or the first note of a coordinated strike? The truth, as it would unravel, was far more deliberate than anyone inside the perimeter suspected. Chapter 2: Echoes on the Edge of the Sea. Frost coated the rails and coastal grasses as sentries paced their familiar routes, the kind of repetitive paths that turn into muscle memory after months on duty. The sea looked motionless below them, a dark sheet stretching toward the horizon, but dozens of kilometers offshore, the stillness fractured. In an underground bunker where the air hummed with electricity and the smell of old wiring, a pale dot appeared on a sweeping radar screen, then vanished, then reappeared just slightly lower than before, almost as if moving with intent. A second dot followed, then more, each flickering in a slow rhythm that refused to be categorized cleanly by the system. The operators, used to distinguishing between harmless interference and genuine threats, concluded that these ghostly signatures belonged to sea clutter or the unpredictable behavior of low-altitude wildlife. What they couldn't see was the small Ukrainian reconnaissance devices, non-weaponized, designed purely for atmospheric reading and signal mapping, quietly gathering data on wind drift, humidity, and the faint electromagnetic pulses emanating from the layered defensive systems guarding the shoreline. One of these drones dipped too low and was quickly shot down, but not before transmitting its final packet of readings across encrypted channels. The fall of that tiny craft went unnoticed by most, but in retrospect it marked the first subtle crack in a structure long believed to be beyond penetration. Chapter 3: When patterns start to shift. Inside the primary command center, built deep into the ridgeline overlooking the port, the atmosphere was one of routine vigilance, half concentration, half habit. Dozens of screens streamed data, operators rotated on schedule, and confidence in the layered grid ran high. Yet the faint anomalies detected earlier had already nudged certain automatic systems into altered scan patterns, small changes invisible to human perception but meaningful within the larger choreography of events. When the next set of incoming echoes arrived, these weren't subtle or quiet, they were erratic, rising and dipping with deliberate inconsistency that tricked the system into reevaluating them. The effect on the radar was immediate. Signals multiplied, blended, and blurred into a confusing mesh. Operators tried to classify them, but the system hesitated, caught between labeling them as birds, interference, or unidentified low flyers. When one of the defensive batteries fired in response, the crew saw this as a confident display of control, unaware that this very reaction pushed the system into an automated mode with unintended limitations. In human terms, it was as if a guard dog barked too early, alerting not only the intruder but also revealing the way it responded to certain cues. For Ukrainian analysts watching through mirrored feeds, the shift represented something far more valuable than a successful. It was confirmation that the protective shield had slipped into a pattern that could be exploited with timing rather than brute force. Chapter 4, A Quiet Rising of Shadows. In the cold forests of the Odessa region, launch crews waited in silence, surrounded by frost-coated branches that glittered faintly under a moon that seemed almost too bright for such a night. These teams were not preparing an overwhelming barrage, but rather a carefully timed action intended to test whether the earlier diversions had opened enough space for something more decisive. With a few quick commands, tall launch capsules angled upward, and within seconds, missiles traced fiery paths above the trees before slipping into lower, near-invisible trajectories above the sea. Unlike cinematic depictions of warfare, there was no triumphant cheer from the crew's only stillness, the kind shaped by people who understood the weight of every decision they made. The weapons flew too low for routine detection, weaving through the thin margin where technology and timing intersect, and although the crews could no longer see them, they felt the invisible tether of responsibility stretching out across the dark water. This was the moment where preparation, hope, and uncertainty converged. Whether the missiles reached their intended targets or were lost along the way, the night had already changed course. Chapter 5. The ridgeline ignites. As the missiles approached the Krasnodar coastline, the first pair climbed just enough to scan the terrain ahead, their sensors searching for the heat patterns of exposed infrastructure. Soon, distant silhouettes glowed through the haze structures and systems that stood out in thermal contrast against the cold night. With almost unsettling precision, the first explosion erupted across the hillside, lighting up the ridgeline like a momentary sunrise. A second burst followed only seconds later. To the crew stationed nearby, everything happened too quickly to understand. Vehicles shook under the force, alarms triggered in confused sequences, and the hillside that had once symbolized the port's most dependable line of defense now burned in fractured lines. The so-called Eastern Shield had been breached, not completely, but decisively enough that its reliability was shattered in the span of a heartbeat. And of course, the night was far from finished. The remaining missiles moved toward their separate objectives, continuing a sequence of events that would eventually spread across the port, like the slow, inevitable unraveling of a tightly woven rope. Chapter 6. When the heart of a port falters. By the time the next impacts hit the industrial zones of Novorossiysk, the entire defensive grid struggled to recalibrate. Screens showed scattered shapes, incomplete tracks, and interference patterns left behind by earlier diversions. In that haze of confusion, one missile found a cluster of fuel lines and pumping stations, igniting an eruption that sent heat waves rolling across the terminal. Another struck a larger reservoir, producing a plume that illuminated cranes and warehouses in a haunting orange glow. While these explosions were catastrophic in appearance, their underlying significance was even deeper. The logistical heart of the port, the network of energy and transport veins that allowed Novorossiysk to function as a strategic hub, had been compromised in less than a minute. Electrical systems flickered and died, pressure valves jammed, the hum of industrial life that normally filled the night was replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by distant crackles of fire. For the first time, personnel across the port realized they were dealing with more than a localized attack. They were witnessing a coordinated effort aimed at dismantling not just infrastructure, but the very cohesion of their defensive posture. Chapter 7. Drifters in the Smoke. As flames continued to rise from the industrial corridors, another wave of faint signals emerged at the fringes of what remained of the radar net. These were small drones, again unarmed but equipped with sensors designed to collect structural and thermal data rather than cause harm. Released from multiple locations along the Ukrainian coastline, they drifted toward Novorossiysk in irregular formations, some flying barely above the waterline, others weaving through gaps between cranes and warehouses. The damaged defenses could not distinguish priority targets. Their systems were overwhelmed by an avalanche of signatures. Screens inside the remaining command cabins were flooded with nearly 80 moving points, each one too small to justify expenditure of remaining resources, but too numerous to ignore. operators switched to manual tracking, only to find their controls lagging or freezing entirely. Meanwhile, the drones mapped collapsed pipelines, failing electrical nodes, and structural hotspots brought on by the earlier strikes. Some crashed from heat or debris, but by then their data already been transmitted. The collapse that followed was not the result of more explosions, but of systems failing under the compounded weight of malfunction, overload, and miscommunication. Chapter 8: A Grid of Failures. By 1:44 a.m., Novorossiysk resembled a patchwork of flickering lights and spreading smoke. Entire sections of the electrical grid buckled under the strain of cascading overloads. Cranes stalled mid-rotation, stuck in frozen silhouettes against the fiery sky. Fuel pumps locked into cycles they weren't meant to sustain, creating hazards that emergency crews struggled to contain. A civilian vessel docked nearby suffered minor damage from falling debris, a reminder that the consequences of conflict rarely stay confined to military boundaries. Emergency channels flooded with fragmented reports, tank corridors engulfed in fire, terminals going dark one after another, and unmanned aerial contacts continuing to circle the bay. The defense network, once considered one of the most resilient installations on the coastline, was no longer operating as a single organism, but as a scattering of isolated units acting without coordination. The silence that followed each failing screen inside the main bunker felt heavier than the alarms that had preceded them. Chapter 9: The Moment the Fortress Quieted. Shortly after 2 a.m., with power grids collapsing, relay stations failing, and communication networks fracturing under the strain of conflicting signals, officials declared a state of emergency. Roads were sealed, maritime access suspended, and the port fell under a blanket of smoke and diminishing light. The transition from bustling hub to crippled silhouette was abrupt and unsettling. For years, Novorossiysk had been held up on strategic maps as a fortress, symbolic of control over this stretch of the Black Sea. But by the time the first pale glow of dawn touched the coastline, that identity had dissolved. The ridgeline where advanced systems once stood was now a broken chain of smoldering remains. The industrial fields pulsed with fading embers. The towering cranes and tangled pipelines, once icons of industrial strength, now stood motionless in the dim light, stripped of their certainty. Ukraine hadn't simply targeted a port, it had used timing, misdirection, and the vulnerabilities inherent in any complex system to reveal a truth often overlooked in modern conflict. Even the strongest walls can crumble when too many small failures align at the same moment. Chapter 10: What Surprised You Most? Looking back at the night as a sequence of interlocking threads, the most striking realization is how the downfall of something considered impenetrable came not from overwhelming destructive force, but from a blend of subtle misdirection, well-timed pressure, and the inevitable human limitations within any high-stakes environment. It leaves us with the question, which part of this unraveling surprised you the most? The early misread signals, the collapse of communication, the cascading grid failures, or simply how quietly the first cracks appeared long before the explosions ever lit the sky?